When I got back to our Seattle townhouse 2 hours earlier than planned, the first thing that struck me wasn't the silence. It was the details. The air still carried the faint scent of red wine and something floral, a perfume I couldn't place. On the coffee table sat two still warm wine glasses, beads of condensation sliding down toward Coaster's page, never bothered with unless company was over. The glasses weren't where we usually left them after a drink together. They were angled toward each other, as if two people had been leaning in, talking in low voices. Then my eyes landed on the men's hoodie draped over the arm of the couch. It was too big for Paige, dark navy, and not one I recognized as mine. It wasn't even my size. The sleeves were long enough that the cuffs had been folded back once, and a faint cologne clung to it. Something crisp, like cedar and mint. The kind of scent you notice in the first seconds before someone speaks. And then there was the tablet. Paige's tablet sat open and awake on the ottoman. Normally she was private about it. Lock screens, quick swipes to hide whatever she was looking at. But this time it was just there. I glanced down and saw a digital receipt. The hotel's logo in elegant serif letters, the date and time stamped plainly. Last night. Pioneer Square. A boutique hotel I knew by reputation, small, stylish, the kind of place that sells itself on discretion and curated in *Macy. The room was double occupancy. My stomach tightened. That was the first moment I felt the space between what I thought I knew and what I was starting to see. It was like catching sight of a shadow in your periphery. You can't be sure what it is yet, but your body already knows to brace. In the living room, Paige was cross-legged on the rug, laughing with Cassie and Jules, her two closest friends. They were halfway into a conversation when I walked in, their voices low and playful but edged with something sharper. I realized they were talking about me, about the conditions of my life with Paige, how I was set in my ways, how my evenings were predictable, how I liked things done a certain way. Their laughter had the brittle sound of people who were comfortable being unkind because they assumed their target wasn't in the room. I just stood there in the doorway, my keys still in my hand, letting the moment breathe long enough for them to notice me. When they did, the tone shifted, not all at once, but like someone had dimmed the volume just a fraction. Cassie's smile went tight. Jules cleared her throat and reached for her glass. Paige, though, didn't miss a beat. She turned toward me, all brightness. "You're home early," she said. Like it was a coincidence. Like the air wasn't thick with the aftertaste of whatever they'd been saying. "Yeah," I said, my eyes flicking to the wine glasses, the hoodie, the tablet. "Guess so." She followed my gaze and gave me the kind of smile meant to shut down questions before they start. When I asked about the wine glasses, she said they were celebrating Cassie's new job. The hoodie? Jules's brother had left it at her place, apparently, and she'd just brought it over. The hotel receipt? "Oh, that," Paige said, laughing lightly. "We were going to do a little girls' night downtown. Ended up canceling the room, too tired, came back here instead." Each explanation was quick, tidy, and unprovable. The kind of answers that technically cover the question but don't touch the truth. Before I could press, she steered the conversation toward how exhausted she'd been lately, how easily small misunderstandings could snowball, how she wished we both wouldn't jump to conclusions over harmless details. It wasn't the words that got me. It was the way she moved the spotlight. She had always been good at that, shifting the frame of a conversation until the subject was no longer the subject. The wine glasses became about Cassie's job, the hoodie about someone else's forgetfulness, the hotel about fatigue. All while her friends sat there, sipping their wine, not saying a word. I kept thinking of how many times in the past few months she'd brushed off my unease in just this way. How she'd disabled location sharing, saying it drained her battery. How evening video calls had shifted suddenly to, "Catch you tomorrow. I'm already in bed." How she'd started taking early showers before supposed yoga classes. How cash purchases showed up instead of her usual card charges. The new perfume that wasn't one I'd bought her. And the locked group chats where I'd overheard Cassie and Jules once telling her she should live without compromises. We'd gone from shared plans to canceled dinners, from we to I, from boundaries to blurred lines. It wasn't about chores or schedules or even disagreements. It was about feeling like I was being eased out of my own life, one quiet exclusion at a time. That day, standing in our living room with her friend's smirks fading, I didn't start an argument. I didn't accuse. I just took in the details, filed them away. Every word, every shift in her tone, every look Cassie and Jules didn't quite hide. I knew this was one of those moments you don't get back. You either catch it in its raw form, or you let it slip and try to reconstruct it later from memory. So I let her talk, watched her pivot the conversation until the thread we'd started on was gone entirely. Then I smiled, said I'd let them get back to their night, and went upstairs. It was easier to leave the room than to pretend I didn't already feel the shape of what was coming. I didn't go back downstairs. I shut our bedroom door and sat on the edge of the bed like I was in a hotel room someone else had booked under my name. The house had that bright, late-afternoon Seattle light, thin, reflective, the kind that makes everything look cleaner than it feels. I stared at the floor and let the last few months spool out like security footage I'd ignored. Location sharing, off. She said a system update reset her settings, then never turned it back on. Battery life, she'd said, and rolled over. The next week, our nightly FaceTime turned into, already in bed? Babe, long day. Then a quick voice call from the dark where I could hear traffic that didn't belong to our street. Early showers before yoga. New leggings shipped to the office instead of home. Cash withdrawals in neat, forgettable amounts. A perfume I didn't recognize following her into rooms and out of arguments. The group chats were the chorus. I didn't see the messages, not directly, but I saw the outlines. Lock icons, fast thumbs, Cassie's name, Jules's popping up right after. Once, when her phone mirrored to the TV by accident, a notification banner flashed and vanished. You deserve joy with no compromises. I told myself that could mean benign things. An art class, more sleep, a weekend with her sister. I wanted to believe the easy version. What changed wasn't her calendar. On paper she was as busy as ever, but the energy. Shared plans evaporated first. We'd made a list of hikes for summer. Then every Saturday slid into rain check. Then boundaries eroded. She began reading my calendar like a playbook for when I wouldn't be home. The last to go was respect, thin as tissue, tearing every time I asked a reasonable question. I stopped asking. Downstairs, the laughter from the living room came in little bursts, like clinking ice. I looked at the men's hoodie on the couch, the 2 wine glasses, the hotel receipt still open on her tablet, and decided I didn't need to argue about any of it. I needed a timeline. I opened the app tied to our car tracker. 2 years ago, I'd installed it for practical reasons. Break-ins, insurance, the small comfort of knowing where the Civic wound up in a city that eats bumpers for breakfast. I hadn't opened it in months. Now the map loaded like a confession. There it was, regular stops in Pioneer Square. Same boutique hotel. Tuesday nights, Thursday lunches, 2 Saturday afternoons she'd called yoga workshops. The breadcrumb trail didn't argue. It just glowed. My hands were steady in a way that felt wrong. I took **TS of the pins, turned on screen recording, and sat still until my breathing stopped trying to rush me. Then I grabbed my jacket, slipped out while more laughter rose from the living room, and drove. The sky over the waterfront was low and colorless, ferries sliding across gray water like quiet thoughts. I parked a block from the hotel, the kind with plants too healthy for real life and a front desk that speaks in hushes. I didn't know what result I wanted, clarity, I guess, but I knew I couldn't go home with only maybes. I stood near a column where I could see the lobby, phone in my hand like I was checking email. People came and went with rolling suitcases. The soundtrack, the soft wheel click of travelers who won't stay long enough to make a mess. Paige arrived the way she does when she wants to be seen without looking like she wants to be seen. Hair half up, black coat, the lipstick she calls low-stakes red. She didn't look around for me. She looked for him. Nate. I'd met him at her company barbecue. Tall, an ingratiating smile, the kind of coworker who puts a hand on your shoulder the second time he meets you. In the lobby, he held out his palms like magnets for hers. She gave them. He leaned in. She tilted her face the way she does when she plans to accept a kiss. At the front desk, he said something to the clerk and held a card sleeve between 2 fingers. The clerk slid a key card into it. He pressed it into Paige's hand, their fingers staying there a beat too long for anything except a story they'd already told each other. I lifted my phone and recorded, framing it like a tourist with too much cloud storage. I didn't go after them. I didn't even wait for the elevator doors to close. I had enough. In the car, I set the phone in the cup holder and watched the video twice with the sound off. It looked worse without audio, like a dream too sharp to be mine. Driving back, I took the long way along the lake. My brain kept trying to force an immediate decision, like the part of me that manages emergencies wanted to flip every lever at once. Instead, I told myself, list, method, light. I said it out loud so I'd hear a human voice. At home I packed. Not the dramatic kind, no sweeping armfuls, no trash bags. I packed like someone who intends to find things later. Labels, banker's boxes, a notebook, passport, birth certificate, tax files, the documents you can't replace without surrender. I photographed the rooms as they were, time-stamped. I unplugged my personal hard drive. I logged into our joint accounts and disabled autopay, turned off overdraft, redirected my direct deposit. I left the shared balance intact because that's what the lawyer blogs say to do until counsel tells you otherwise. I exported statements. I signed out of devices. I set a new phone pin. Then I called a locksmith. Not the guy with the shouting 24/7 ad, but the one our property manager recommends when a deadbolt sticks. I used the emergency line. The manager answered, groggy but professional, and listened while I explained that I was the leaseholder, that I'd pay for rekeying, that a second key would live with him for legal access. He didn't ask why. Seattle teaches people not to pry. By midnight, the work was done. New cylinders, new keys, the front door closing with an unfamiliar hush. I put one key in an envelope for the manager and slid it under his office door. I left the other on my ring. In the bedroom, the closet looked like a stage after strike. Gaps where my clothes had been, dust outlines of shoes. I took the framed photos from my nightstand and set them face down in a small box labeled Later, because I didn't know what else to call it. I shut the door like I was closing a book mid-chapter. I wrote Paige an email, not a text. Logistics only. A list of what I'd taken, where to find copies, how to arrange pickup for her remaining items once I packed what was mine. I gave times. I used bullet points. I read it twice and cut any sentence that sounded like a feeling. At 1 a.m., I walked out with 2 boxes and a duffel and didn't look back at the row house's windows to see if someone had moved the curtains. Caleb's studio near Lake Union has a loose doorframe and a view of boats that belong to people who say, spend the night on the water, without irony. He handed me a spare key without questions. Just a nod that said he'd heard enough over the last year to fill in blanks. I set the boxes on the floor and stood in the new quiet. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was the absence of static. I opened the notebook and wrote the date. Then I wrote every step I'd taken that night in clean lines, like a lab record. Action, time, confirmation. It felt clinical, which is what I wanted. If I treated this like procedure, I could keep my hands steady. I slept on his pull-out couch and dreamed about doors that open with cards instead of keys. In the dream, I never went inside. I just held the card and watched the light stay red. When morning showed up pale and damp, I woke without that tight cord of dread that had been living behind my ribs. For the first time in months, my shoulders didn't feel like a question. I made coffee in Caleb's chipped French press, reset passwords, turned off subscription renewals, and created an email folder labeled Legal, even though I hadn't called anyone yet. I sorted my life into stacks. Every stack was a decision I could make without asking permission. I told myself I wasn't running. I was documenting, and documentation, done right, keeps you from the kind of emotional whiplash that makes you mistake someone else's chaos for your own. The first morning at Caleb's came with the kind of quiet you don't trust at first. I could hear the gulls over Lake Union and the hum of his building's old elevator. But inside the studio, everything felt padded, like the room itself was trying not to jolt me. I made coffee, opened my notebook, and drew a line down the middle of a page. Logistics/feelings. I left the right column blank on purpose. By 10 a.m., Paige started texting. The The first one was bright and performative. "So where did you run off to, detective?" Faced with tears of joy, I watched the bubble fade and didn't answer. Another text followed. A photo of the men's hoodie bagged up with a caption, "Mystery solved. Jules left this." Then came a paragraph about how partners should communicate like adults, and how I owe her the benefit of the doubt. None of it touched last night. I typed, deleted, typed again. Finally, I sent a single line. "Email me any logistics. I'll schedule pickups." I added a calendar link and closed messages. My hands shook afterward, not from sadness so much as the tremor of breaking a habit. At lunch, I walked the path along the water and called the bank from a park bench. The woman on the phone sounded like a kindergarten teacher as she walked me through freezing a card and splitting autopays. When she asked for a reason, I said, "Household change," and the phrase felt like a clean incision. Paige's next set of messages came late afternoon. The humor had congealed into something colder. "Super controlling move with the accounts," she wrote. "You're making a scene over nothing. Cassie and Jules agree this is you spiraling." I replied with the same template. "Logistics by email only. Pick up Saturday 10 to 12 or Tuesday 6 to 8. I'll be present." I pasted the address of Caleb's storage unit and hit send. By evening, she called twice. I let them go to voicemail and wrote down the times in my notebook. Documentation isn't romantic, but it keeps me from talking to the version of her that lives in my head. The calls turned into voice notes, her favorite way to control a conversation. I didn't listen. I saved them to a folder labeled Unheard. That night, I packed the rest of my clothes from the townhouse while a locksmith's receipt warmed in my pocket. I took only what I could carry in one trip, left a typed inventory on the kitchen island, and locked the door behind me with a key that clicked differently. On the drive back to Caleb's, I realized I wasn't rehearsing comebacks anymore. I was rehearsing boundaries, which are quiet by design. The next day, she sent a string of selfies meant to look accidental. Paige smiling with a mug, Paige under a blanket, Paige at her desk under warm office lights. The captions ran like a monologue. "We can still fix this. You always overreact. Don't embarrass yourself." I muted the thread and forwarded the landlord my updated contact info. My hands stayed steady. I kept my side of the street boring on purpose. I created an email folder, property, and another, financial. I scanned in a copy of our lease, the last 2 years of joint utilities, and a list of serial numbers for anything expensive. I set up a P.O. box and filed a change of address. When my heart tried to sprint, I counted the steps out loud. Print, sign, scan, send. The messages from Paige slid from condescension to something like loneliness over 3 days. "I miss you," she wrote once, then followed with a meme about cats being dramatic. No accountability, only interruption. I answered 1 out of every 5 emails. Pick up windows, a neutral confirmation when she asked for her passport, a polite received when she requested a box of keepsakes from the hall closet. Each response felt like tightening a jar lid and setting it back on a shelf I could reach later. On the 4th night, I slept straight through. I woke to drizzle against Caleb's window and the sensation that a barbed wire had been unwound from around my chest. I didn't miss the marriage. I missed the version of myself who kept the floor swept and the noise low. The man who said no without apologizing for the firmness of the word. Friday, I met with an attorney in a quiet office near South Lake Union. I told her I wasn't asking the court to teach anyone a lesson. I just wanted my life delineated. She nodded, slid me a checklist, and told me to keep doing what I was doing. Document, be civil, treat every message like it will be read out loud later. That night, the tone of Paige's messages shifted again. Less script, more static. "I hate this," she wrote. "I hate that we're being weird." A minute later, "Cassie says you want me isolated." Another minute, "Jules says you're trying to create a narrative." I put the phone face down and let it vibrate against the table until the battery icon went red. On Sunday afternoon, she asked to pick up clothes. I offered 2 windows and asked her to bring someone neutral. She brought Cassie. They arrived 10 minutes late, laughing at something I wasn't invited to know. I kept the door open, kept my hands visible, kept the boxes stacked by the entryway with lists taped to the flaps. Paige tried to make eye contact. I looked at the labels. Wow, Cassie said, scanning the boxes. Somebody's been busy building a case. I've been busy building a boundary, I said, and watched her file the line away for later use. They left with 3 boxes and the hoodie in a paper bag. After they were gone, I sat on the stairs and listened to the house settle around me like a creature deciding whether to nap or flee. I took a picture of the empty entryway and saved it with the others. 2 days later, the weather broke and the city smelled like wet concrete and cedar. I was alphabetizing my legal folder when the buzzer rang at Caleb's. It was Paige. No bravado, no entourage, just rain on her coat and a look I hadn't seen on her face since before the group chats got mean. I have something, she said when I opened the door. You don't have to let me in. I can hand it to you right here. She was shaking, not with drama but with whatever arrives after the script runs out. She passed me her phone. **TS. A thread between her and Cassie, another with Jules. The same voices that had been coaching her toward no compromises were ridiculing her attempts to repair anything. In one, Cassie wrote, "He only respects power. Make him chase." In another, Jules said, "If he leaves, you'll upgrade." Underneath, Paige had typed, "I think I broke something I can't replace." "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she said. "I just need you to know what was in my head wasn't only mine." She swallowed. "And there's Nate." I ended it. I told him it started when I stopped respecting boundaries, yours and mine. I blocked him. You can read it. She held out one more **T. A final text to Nate. A block of gray bubbles after that with no responses from her. Rain threaded down from the awning like beaded strings. I didn't invite her upstairs. I stood in the doorway and scrolled until my thumb hurt. I kept my voice even. "Thank you for bringing this. I don't have a circle anymore," she said. A small half-laugh that wasn't a joke. The cost got real. I can see it now. We agreed to meet in a public place, neutral ground, structured time. Capitol Hill, she suggested. That cafe with the plants in the window. I set a time, told her the agenda would be next steps only, and repeated the ground rule I'd been living by. Structured dialogue, measurable behavior, no promises. After she left, I washed my hands and sat on Caleb's floor, surrounded by neat stacks of paper that looked like they belonged to someone better at life than me. I wrote a new page in the notebook, criteria. Under it, I listed what a conversation couldn't do and what actions would mean something. At the bottom I wrote one sentence, centered so I couldn't miss it. I keep the locks as they are until I decide the story ends or continues with light and proof. The Capitol Hill Cafe was just waking up when I got there. Steam fogging the windows, the air inside heavy with the smell of espresso and baked bread. I'd picked it for a reason. Open enough that neither of us could retreat into whispers. Quiet enough that the words would sit between us without a buffer of noise. Paige was already there, seated at a two-top near the window. She'd chosen a seat with her back to the street, which told me she didn't want to watch for my arrival. She wanted to control her view of me. Her coat was folded over the chair beside her, a small act of claiming the space. In front of her, a cappuccino had cooled, the foam caved in. When she saw me, she smiled in that tight, deliberate way that says I've rehearsed this. I didn't match it. I sat down, pulled my notebook from my jacket, and opened it to the page I'd titled Criteria. "I want to be clear," I said before she could start. "This is not reconciliation. This is a conversation about terms." She nodded quickly, like she was relieved to have a script. "I understand." I didn't think she did, but I let her talk. She began with Nate, recounting how it had started by accident during late nights at work. She said it was over, that she'd blocked him, that the **TS I'd seen weren't even the worst of what she'd deleted. "I didn't respect your boundaries," she admitted, her hands around the cup like it might keep her words warm. "And I stopped respecting my own." She slid a printout across the table, an email to HR formally requesting to transfer out of Nate's team, dated and acknowledged. She'd CC'd her personal email for proof. Then she moved to Cassie and Jules. They were my echo chamber, she said. Every time I hesitated, they pushed me forward, made it sound like strength. She handed me another set of **TS, these showing her leaving their group chat. The last message she'd sent them was one line. You cost me more than you know. The words on the page looked final, but I knew better than to treat them as proof of permanence. Cutting ties isn't the same as changing behavior, I said. I know, she said, and for once her tone didn't sound defensive. We went through my list. Individual therapy for both of us, paid separately. Weekly joint sessions with a counselor of my choosing. All finances untangled, no shared accounts, no co-signed anything. A 6-month trial of living apart, during which any breach of agreed boundaries would end the arrangement without negotiation. She agreed to every point without argument. Too quickly, almost like someone signing a contract they hadn't read because they needed the pen back in your hand. You keep the locks as they are, I added. You do not come to the townhouse without written agreement, and all communication outside of therapy and logistics stays in email. No texts. Her jaw tightened, but she nodded. The server came by to clear the table, and we both went silent until he walked away. When we were alone again, Paige leaned in slightly. I want you to know I've been looking at myself, really looking. I don't like the person I was with you these last months. Or with them. It wasn't an apology so much as a statement of inventory. I made a note in the margin of my list. Aware, not yet accountable. When we stood to leave, she hesitated with her coat half on. Would you ever consider letting me back into the house? I didn't answer. That silence was my answer. Outside, the rain had lightened to a mist that blurred the outlines of the street. We walked in opposite directions without saying goodbye. I felt lighter than when I'd walked in, not because anything had been fixed, but because every term was now on paper. Back at Caleb's, I scanned the signed copy of the agreement we'd made at the table and filed it under interim. Then I sat for a long time without doing anything else, listening to the sound of boats knocking gently against the dock. 2 days later, her first therapy-only email came through. Subject line, session proposal. It was brief, dates, times, availability. No jokes, no stray comments. For now, she was following the structure. I kept my replies just as short. Caleb noticed the shift in my energy. Feels like you're building a fence instead of a wall, he said one evening over takeout. Maybe, I said, but a fence still has a lock. Over the next weeks, the routine held. Therapy was uncomfortable in the way physical therapy is, tearing scar tissue so something can move again. She cried more than I did. I spoke less than she did. We stuck to the framework. What surprised me wasn't how much I learned about her. It was how much I learned about the version of myself that had let so many small breaches slide. I'd mistaken tolerance for patience, and in doing so, I'd made my boundaries negotiable. By the 4th session, the therapist asked if I could imagine trust being rebuilt. I said, trust is the wrong goal. Clarity is the goal. Trust is what comes if clarity survives long enough. Paige didn't argue. Outside those hours, life was startlingly calm. I walked more. Cooked meals I didn't have to defend from casual criticism. Read at night without someone sighing beside me. One Saturday, I passed the Pioneer Square Hotel on my way to a bookstore. I didn't slow down, but I noticed the lobby looked exactly as it had that night I filmed her and Nate. Same plants, same marble counter, same bell on the desk. The sight didn't punch me in the ribs this time. It just confirmed that places don't change, only people do. That night, I wrote a single sentence in my notebook. If the trial ends tomorrow, I'm already living in my decision. It was the first time I believed it. By the end of the 2nd month, the trial period had settled into something that almost felt like normal. Not the old normal, but a framework that didn't collapse every time someone breathed too hard. The weekly therapy was the anchor. I'd walk in with a short list in my pocket, stick to it, and walk out without the usual psychic hangover that used to follow our arguments at home. Paige was consistent in showing up, but consistency isn't the same as progress. She said the right things about boundaries, about being present, about how she'd dismantled her circle and deleted the chats, but I'd learned to file her words under pending verification. Living at Caleb's made it easier. His studio was small, but the constraints worked in my favor. Every item in the place had a reason to be there. I kept my boxes stacked along the far wall, labeled in thick black marker, like a visual reminder that this arrangement was still temporary. The only contact outside therapy was through email. I kept each reply like a surgical stitch, tight, minimal, functional. She stuck to it, but the tone shifted as the weeks passed. In the beginning, her emails were brisk and businesslike. By week 6, there were little slips, phrases like, "I hope your week's going well," or, "You'd like this place I found." I didn't engage. I didn't want to give her the wrong metric to measure progress. The first real test came on a Thursday night. I was leaving a late meeting when I saw her name light up my phone. Not email, but a call. She knew that was outside the rules. I let it go to voicemail. 15 minutes later, another call. Then a text. "Need to talk. Urgent." I pulled over, read it twice, then wrote back, "Email it." She did 3 minutes later. Her urgent was that she'd run into Nate at a coffee shop. She insisted it was accidental, that she'd left as soon as she saw him, but she didn't want to hide it. I replied with 2 words. Noted. Logged. Then I put my phone face down and drove the rest of the way to Caleb's without looking at it again. That weekend in therapy, she brought it up before I could. She described the encounter, swore she'd walked out mid-order, and even offered the receipt to prove it. I didn't ask for it. Proof is useful, but willingness to follow the rules without being caught is the real measure. "You're not angry?" she asked, halfway between surprised and suspicious. "I'm not interested in being angry," I said. "I'm interested in data. 1 encounter, no breach logged." She looked at me like she was trying to decide if that was forgiveness or a warning. The second test came less than 2 weeks later, and it wasn't about Nate. I was in line at the market when I saw her with Cassie. They didn't see me. Paige was holding a grocery basket, Cassie walking beside her, both laughing at something. It didn't look tense. It looked easy. Our agreement had been clear. No contact with the friends who'd encouraged her to escalate instead of repair. In therapy, she'd nodded at that condition, said she understood. I left the market without buying anything. That night, I got the email, ran into Cassie. We caught up for a minute. I know it's against the rules, but it felt rude to walk away. I read it 3 times, then archived it without reply. At our next session, I waited until the halfway mark before bringing it up. Was the point of the no-contact rule politeness? I asked her. Or was it clarity? She didn't answer right away. "Clarity," she said finally. "So what do you call ignoring it?" She started to defend herself, but stopped. "A breach," she admitted. The therapist watched us both for a beat before asking me, "What does that breach mean for you?" "It means the lock stays on the fence," I said. Paige's shoulders slumped, but she didn't argue. Outside the office, we walked in opposite directions again. The gap between us felt wider than it had at the start of the trial, and I realized that was because my side of the fence hadn't moved. By month 3, I'd stopped checking the clock on therapy days. They were just part of the calendar, like paying bills or taking out the recycling. Some sessions were quiet, just reports of compliance. Others, like the one after the Cassie incident, carried the weight of knowing a small fracture in the rules was also a map of where the old patterns still lived. The rest of my life was starting to feel like mine again. I picked up my guitar for the first time in years, started running along the lake trail in the mornings, even met Caleb's friends for trivia nights. They didn't ask about Paige. I didn't volunteer. The last week of the trial, I sat down with my notebook and read through every entry from the day I'd left the townhouse. Every boundary, every breach, every compliance noted without embellishment. It looked less like a love story and more like a case file. At our final scheduled session, the therapist asked the question I'd been expecting. "Do you want to extend the trial or make a decision?" I looked at Paige. She looked tired, not in a cosmetic way, but in the way someone looks when they've been living under a set of terms they can't quite meet. "I think we're done," I said. She blinked, like she'd heard it but hadn't prepared for it. "Done as in I'm keeping the locks as they are. As in, the trial's over and so is the marriage." The therapist gave us both a moment, then asked if there was anything either of us wanted to say before closing the file. Paige said nothing. I didn't either. We stood, shook the therapist's hand, and walked out into the late afternoon light. Outside, she finally spoke. I thought I could meet your terms. I really did. I didn't set them to be met, I said. I set them to measure. And we measured. She nodded once, looked away, and walked toward her car. Back at Caleb's, I packed the last of my boxes into my car. I didn't have to go back to the townhouse for anything. I'd made sure of that. As I carried the final box down the narrow hall, I felt the strange mix of relief and grief that comes when a door closes exactly the way you've told it to. On the drive to my new apartment, a one-bedroom with too much light and not enough furniture, I thought about the first night I'd left the townhouse. How the air had felt clean and dangerous at the same time. This felt like that, but steadier. In the kitchen of the new place, I set my notebook on the counter. I didn't need to keep adding to it. The record was complete. For the first time in months, I poured a glass of wine, sat in my own chair, and didn't feel like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. The trial had given me my answer. It wasn't her. It was me on my side of the fence with the lock exactly where I wanted it.